Hello and welcome to this Tinkershop tutorial. My name is Martin from the Innisfil Idea Lab and Library, and today I'm going to be showing you how to use MakeCode Arcade to create this cool little shark dodging game. And the idea of this is we have a bunch of sharks randomly coming across the screen and we have to dodge them. And if our player touches one of the sharks, meaning it gets eaten, then it's game over. And we have a little score counter that increments based on how long the player survives. And so the idea is just to survive as long as possible and without getting eaten and just get a high score. And it's surprisingly not that many blocks of code to get this done. So let's jump right into it and build this out. Alright, so you're going to want to head over to arcade.makecode.com and then click on New Project and give your project a name. You can call it whatever you want and then click Create. And so the first thing we're going to do is create our background image, and to do that we'll click on Scene and then grab this set background image block and drag it into the on start block, and then click on this blank square which will open up the editor. And so I'll just quickly make kind of an underwater like background. So I'll use the fill tool and fill it in with like aquamarine, and then we'll use the pencil and the color green and just draw in some seaweed just like that. So I'm not going to go too crazy. You're welcome to pause the video if you want to, really spend some time on making a great background. Of course, you can always go back and edit this later as well. So that's good enough for now. I'm going to click on Done. And then great, we have our background image there. So next thing we're going to want to do is add in some sharks. Remember we're going to want to randomly generate sharks coming from the right hand side and moving from the right to the left. So click on the game category and grab this on game update every 500 milliseconds block. So inside this block we're gonna generate a random shark, and it's gonna run every 500 milliseconds. Now actually I don't want it to go that fast, so I'm gonna click on that and change it to 1 second or 1,000 milliseconds. So every 1 second we'll generate a new shark. So let's go ahead and do that. Click on Sprites and then go down to Projectiles and grab this first block here. Set projectile to and drag that into our on-game update block. And then we have to create the image for this projectile, and in our case it's going to be a shark, so I'm going to click on that. And instead of using the editor, I'm just going to click on Gallery and then scroll down. Should see some sharks. There we go. And I'm just going to click this one here and click Done. Alright, so that's good. It's creating a shark every second, but it's not moving the way that we want. And to control its movement and direction, we want to change these Vx and Vy values. So these values represent the velocity, so like how fast the shark is moving in each direction, either left and right or up and down. So we don't actually want the sharks moving up or down at all. So we'll just set the Vy value to 0. So just click in that and type in 0. And then if I refresh refresh our simulator. Okay, so now our sharks are moving side to side, but they're all moving in the wrong direction. So we just have to reverse this value. So instead of 50 pixels per second, we'll move them minus 50 pixels per second. And then, okay, so now our sharks are moving in the right direction. They're showing up every second as we want, but they're all up at the top. So what we have to do is when we create a new shark, we also have to set its Y position, and we'll want it to kind of be random, but make sure it's within our screen. So to do that, go back into the sprites category and grab this set my sprite position to block and drag that under our projectile creation, and then make sure you change this from my sprite to projectile because our shark is the projectile. And so for the X position, we want it to be, right on like the right hand side of the screen. So if I click inside the X value, you can use the coordinate picker to kind of guess, but I want right at the edge of the screen. So that's 160 pixels. So I'm just going to type in 160 for the X coordinate. And then for the Y value, we want it to be random. So we can't just put one number in here. We'll have to go into the math category and then grab this pick random 0 to 10 block and drag that inside of our Y value. So each time this code runs, it'll pick a random number. Right now it's 0 to 10, but we want it to the range to actually be kind of near the top of the screen to the bottom. And I think from top to bottom it's 120 pixels, but we don't want the sharks to be really cut off much, so we'll give it a bit of padding and we'll go with a random number between 5 pixels and 115. So that's 5 pixels of padding. And there we go. Our sharks are moving across the screen. They're not terribly cut off. And so I think that's great. And now we can add our player into the mix. Okay, so to add our player, we're going to do that right in the on start block. So I'll move this down a bit. And we're going to go into sprites. And then under create, grab this set my sprite to block and drag that in. And then we have to click this square where you could use the editor to draw your own sprite. I'm just gonna go into gallery and just choose this little duck sprite and then click done. And there we go. We have a player sprite. It's right in the center of the screen. Now we want them to appear near the back of the screen. So let's go ahead and set the sprite position. So go back into sprites and then under physics, grab the set my sprite position to block, drag that underneath. And you can kind of use the coordinate picker. So if you click in the X or Y value, you can just kind of find the spot near the back of the screen and in the middle. Now that's a little bit cut off, so let's move it over a little bit. I think we do 10 for the X value and I think 60 for the Y value because there's 120 pixels. So that'll be right in the center vertically and right near the back without our player being cut off. All right, so that's great. The next thing we want to do is add a little bit of gravity so that unless our player jumps by pressing the A button, which we'll do later, that the players are going to, like, slowly fall to the bottom of the screen. So To do that, we'll use the velocity again. So go back into sprites and then grab the set my sprite velocity block. And we don't want any like forward or backward velocity, so we'll set the Vx value to 0. And then we do want the player to kind of fall down, and that actually seems, if I refresh that again, that's a pretty good rate. So we can actually leave that the Vy value to 50, so that the player will slowly fall down to the ground, but we don't want them to go off the screen. So go back into sprites, and under effects, grab this set my sprite to stay in screen block, drag that in, and then make sure that you have this switch set to on. And so now the player falls down, and if they hit the ground, they stay in the screen. And similarly, when we add the ability for the player to kind of jump, they won't be able to jump off the screen. So that's great. Let's make the player be able to move now. Okay, so the controls in this game are actually really simple. The gravity pushes the player down, and so the only control that the player has is to jump to push their character back up. And so to add the controls, go into controller and then grab this on a button pressed block. Now if you want to make it easier, since there's only one button, it doesn't really matter which button they press. So you can actually just change this to on any button pressed. So now when they press any button, the duck will kind of flap and jump back up. So the first thing I actually want to do is change the image of our sprite. So right now our sprite is this duck with its wings kind of up in the air. And when we push a button, we'll change the image so that the duck flaps its wings down, and that'll make it look like it's kind of like flapping to push itself up. So the first thing we're gonna do is go into sprites and then down to image and set my sprite image to. And so we'll grab that, click inside the square, and then go to gallery, and then set it to the duck with its wings pointed down, and then click done. And so then we actually want to set our player sprite to move upwards. And so we'll go into sprites under physics and then grab the set my sprite velocity. And so what we're gonna do is basically reverse the velocity of the sprite. So by default it's moving down. So we'll wanna kind of briefly send our sprite moving upwards for like a half second to kind of simulate a jump. So we'll keep the Vx velocity at 0, and then instead of 50, which is pushing the sprite downwards, we'll make it minus 50. Oops. And then so now if I do that and press a button, you can see it changes the velocity, but we only want that to happen for like a few seconds, right? Because if our player kind of flaps once, it should boost it upwards, but only for a few seconds. So we'll put in a pause here, and after actually only like half a second, we'll reset the velocity back to the default, so that the player's moving back downwards. So we're gonna need a pause block, which you can grab in the loops category, and then grab the pause, We'll set that to about half a second, so 500 milliseconds. And then, so after they've flapped, and there's like a half-second pause, we'll want to change the sprite's position, or sorry, the image of our sprite back to the default, as well as set the velocity back to our default. So go into sprites, and then down to the bottom, and grab the set my sprite image to. Click on the square, and then in the gallery, grab the default duck that we use. I think it was this one. Then we'll change it back, and then we have to grab another set my sprite velocity block and set that back to the default, which is a Vx of 0 and a Vy of plus 50. So let's try this out now. I'll use the large simulator, and you can see, there we go. We press the button and our duck kind of flaps up for a couple seconds, and then if you want them to keep going, you have to keep pressing. So very simple controls, but it allows our duck to kind of dodge all these sharks. And now nothing's happening, of course, if the player's actually colliding with the sharks. So we'll have to add that in. We'll have to handle those collisions, and we'll actually make it so if the player touches a shark, it's game over. So let's go ahead and add that in. All right, so to detect collisions of our player sprite to the projectiles, which are sharks, there's a special collisions block under sprites. So click sprites and then go down to overlaps and just grab this first block, on sprite of kind player overlaps other sprite of kind player. And so this block by default with these values will detect a player sprite overlapping another player sprite. But remember, our shark is actually a type of projectile. So what we want to do is change this last value from player to projectile. So now this block will detect whenever a player overlaps one of our projectiles, and then it'll run the code within it. And what we want to do if this happens is trigger the game over function. So go into the game category and grab this game over block, drag that in, make sure it's set to lose, and if we click this plus, we can change the animation that happens with the game over. So right now it's like this confetti animation, but if we click this, we can actually change it to bubbles, which I think is just a little bit more appropriate for our underwater world. So you can see now, if we make contact with a shark, it triggers game over, and we see all these like bubbles. Okay, so that's pretty good. We've almost got a complete game, but the thing is, there's really no incentive here for staying alive longer, right? So what we can do is add a score, and we can increment the score by 1 point every second that the player is alive. And so we can do that in this on-game update block because it's already running every second. And so if we go into there and then go into info, grab this underscore, grab the change score by 1 block, drag that in, and now we can see the longer we stay alive, the more that our score is increasing. And then if we die, it'll actually display our score as well as the high score. So that's really great. And at this point, the game is pretty much done. One small improvement we can also add is we can have that little bubble effect. We can set it to kind of go throughout the game just to make the whole environment look a little bit more realistic. So I think that is under scene and then effects. So grab this start screen confetti effect, drag that into our on-game update block. Let's move some things around. Change that to bubbles. And then click this little plus icon and change it to just 100 milliseconds. So it'll just run this effect, for 1/10 of a second. And so there we go. We got this nice little bubble effect. Combined with our background, it really looks like we are underwater. All right, so with that, we've now completed our game and you can just have fun playing it. I think this is a pretty good little game considering we didn't have to write all that much code. Of course, there's always things you could add. In this case, you could add lives to give the player a few chances to kind of avoid the sharks. You could also add different sounds and effects or, whatever else that you can think of. So I hope you enjoyed watching this video. I hope you learned something. And most of all, I hope you have a great day. Thanks.